Hi, guys. Happy Friday. Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Good morning.
We made it, week 1. I was so excited. I got back from dropping the dog at doggy daycare this morning, and there was a huge box at the house, and I thought, oh, what's this? This is pretty sizable. Couldn't lift it on my own. Had the kids helping me. Brought it in, and I got all these new dishes. So I don't know. You guys are in college. Some of you might be living in your dorms. I still have my dorm plates. They're chipped. I've glued them, they're rainbow swirls. They're just totally, I had to adult. And this week, I adulted and I ordered these plates, and I unwrapped them all right before getting on with you guys. And I realized at the bottom it says, safe to microwave, safe to, put in the dishwasher, but will be boiling hot to the touch. And I zapped it for, a minute. The kids are never going to be able to use these plates. Whatever the paint is like, right out of the kiln. Oh man. So be careful. Make sure you dig into the research before you adult and buy a $250 worth of plates. Anyway, happy Friday. Excited to see you guys. Who's going to win this Super Bowl?
I don't even know who's playing.
Hopefully anyone but Tom Brady.
Oh, see, it's a struggle for me. I grew up in Mansfield, Massachusetts. That is the town adjacent to Foxborough where the stadium is, right? My dad's from Foxborough. My mom's from Mansfield. My high school plays all their Super Bowls in the stadium. We're pretty lucky. And so it's a hometown, like it's a legit hometown thing. But it was tough. It's really just hard seeing Tom Brady in a new uniform. I know back home it's pretty personal. So, but Mahomes is amazing, man. That guy is gonna, I know Brady's the GOAT, but I don't know. Mahomes may oust him. That guy is incredible. So it'll be good to watch. But by ourselves, Zooming with friends, not gathering, right? Okay. All right. Awesome. Looks like we have a full house today. Terrific. Good to see you guys. Let's circle back before we bounce into the biomes. So what did we find out? Did you guys get a chance to look at the data sets? Remember what we were doing again? We were taking averages of finches in the Galapagos Islands, that had not survived the drought. So likely they were working with carcasses, measuring beak length, beak depth, beak width, tarsus, which was the bones in the feet, and weight, okay? And they did that on these dead birds that didn't survive the drought in 77. And then the birds that were probably alive and they were, you know, they had mist netted them, put up a net and the birds flew into them and they were able to tag and measure them. So you guys were making graphs, doing standard deviations, taking averages, and then finally doing a t-test to compare to see if there was a statistical difference in the means of all of those things that we measured. But specifically, we had a hypothesis before we left. And Zoe, you want to remind everybody what the hypothesis was?
That the feet weren't important. I don't know what. That the beaks I think were the most prominent.
Yeah.
Change.
Yeah. So what did we find out? Remember, when we do a t-test, you get an output that's the p-value, right? A p-value that's less than a 0.05 suggests there's a statistical difference in the mean. Like we might make the graph and it might totally look like there's a difference, but until we do that t-test or ANOVA and get a p-value and evaluate it versus that 0.05, we can't tell the difference. So what did the tarsus fall out as? Do you guys remember? Anybody have their spreadsheet up? Somebody must have done it.
0.07. I don't have it pulled up, but I think I remember it was 0.07. So it is insignificant.
Absolutely, right? So who the heck, what kind of bird needs feet, right? Especially island birds, right? Islands are, you know, it's harder to get predators onto an island unless we like fly them over, which happens actually kind of often, unfortunately. But you've probably heard of stories where there's these like giant honking birds that are flightless, and oftentimes they're on islands, right? And that's usually because they don't have predators. So of all the variables that these guys measured, this power couple, right, it's the grants, it looks like the tarsus shows up with a p-value of 0.07, which, you know, there may be a slight difference, but it's not a statistically different enough difference. However, did every other measure, the weight and all the beak things, show up as having statistical difference?
Yes.
Yeah. So what that suggests is that those must be really important traits for survival. So, you know, beaks and weight, they kind of go hand in hand, right? My mouth and Easter time, when, what do you call them? Cadbury mini eggs come out, right? My gape size increases like 25-fold, right? So the bigger and stronger your beak, if it gets to be, you know, hard times and a drought and all the seeds that remain are these really tough shelled ones, it's going to make more sense for those that had that strong beak, bigger beak, to be able to process the food and get bigger, make more babies, survive, right? Remember those vital functions we talked about. So, you know, it makes sense those smaller beaks and smaller sized birds are not going to fare as well in scenarios like that. Now, what's important to note about the Galapagos is it's actually, you know, from year to year, it varies what kind of, you know, is it going to be a rainy, is it going to be a drought kind of season? It just happens to be in this situation where it could go either way. So we'll find out later in our genetics, and maybe you guys in genetics class have learned it already, but this beak scenario, having small and large beaks within your population, they're actually they retain in the population some small beaked birds and some large beaked birds. That variation is really important because you got to have somebody who's going to make it depending on what kind of way the weather goes that year, right? You need that variation, okay? Good job, way to go, stats, folks. Awesome. So let's move on. Everybody feeling good about stats? All right, little pop quiz here. 2 types of data. They both begin with Q. What's the first type?
Qualitative.
Qualitative. Those are numbers, right? 2 types of qualitative data. Counts. What's a count?
Well, we have discrete and continuous, but that's quantitative.
Oh, did we say qualitative? Yes. I'm sorry,
Mhm.
it's Friday
Yeah,
and I haven't
that's
finished
okay.
my coffee. Yes. So quantitative are the numbers, and those are discrete and continuous. And a count, how many birds are you counting, is going to be discrete, and continuous would be if we weighed the birds or measured their beaks, right? That's a continuous variable. We'll be doing that with the tree lab. And when we do the qualitative, that's categories, right? So we're going to have nominal, and what's the other one?
Ordered or
Yeah,
ordinal.
ordinal. Yeah, ordinal. So think of, age classes, A, B, C, D. You can kind of order those if you're talking about grade scale, that sort of thing. Okay, good stuff. And how about in terms of experimental design? We're ecologists. We have all these questions. We know we're going to have a lot of collaborators. What are we going to do if we want to figure out how organisms, what kind of experiment will we use, just kind of evaluating what organisms do in nature? What kind of experimental design? Will we do a lab experiment? No, what's it called? We'll go out in the field, right? So we'll do a field experiment if we want to kind of see natural behaviors. If we want to get at mechanistics, we want to figure out what causes what kind of an experiment will we do? We'll do a manipulative, right? So it'll be like a lab or a greenhouse type thing. And what if we want to kind of monkey in the middle? What if we want to hedge our bets? What kind of an experiment will we do? That might be a new one to you guys. Remember, it began with an M. Mesocosm, right? These are going to be the cattle tanks or the kiddie pools, right? And we'll be able to stock them with a certain amount, replicate them many times, but they'll also all be outside experiencing nature the same way, right? Okay, good stuff. Hint, right? That's going to be important when it comes time for a quiz, right? Those seem to be the trickier ones for people to kind of focus on. All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share screen with you guys and walk you through today's lecture. All right, I first want to get us to the syllabus, right? Let's see what's happening next week, okay? So on our syllabus, on our Moodle site, I've got our daily schedule up, and right now we are starting our biomes lecture. We're about a day behind, not a problem. I've got a lot of wiggle room. You'll notice there's a biome homework. I would say from today onward through when we're done with biomes, feel free to start, checking out the homework, and I'll bring that up in a sec so you can see it. It's actually really fun. It's a cool interactive. So we'll be going through these lessons on biomes, and there's a lot of material. We've got to cover deserts and tropical rainforest, tundra, all that kind of stuff. And there'll be a quiz towards the end of next week. We're going to see how far we've gotten into the material. My guess is we won't get very far into the limits to distribution, which kind of goes hand in hand with biomes, right? You think about how did the plants get there? How did the animals get there? Has a lot to do with how they tolerate temperature, moisture, and soils, which we cover a lot of in biomes, okay? So wherever we get to, the day before the lecture day that's supposed to have a quiz associated with it, I'll let you guys know this is the content that will be covered on it, okay? But you can bet, what is ecology lecture, with a little bit of the stats that we've covered as well as biomes will be fodder for that quiz, okay? So that's coming up, and that homework, all right? In terms of our lab next week, as I mentioned, is going to be the human demography, okay? So feel free to go on there for the Monday lab at least, and take a read through it, make sure you know what's happening, what Dr. Aldred will be covering, looking at human survivorship. And my group do the same thing, say Tuesday night, so you have a sense, okay? All right, I have gone down on our Moodle site to the section on our biomes. I just want to open up and show you again what it is that we're up to, right? The lecture is right here. I'm going to be going through this lecture that's hyperlinked right there. And I have embedded some take-home messages on you know, things that I think are cool, little highlights, right? And a lot of this stuff won't be hyperlinked into the lecture. It'll be here as supplemental stuff, okay? So don't forget to look at the page on Moodle as well as the lecture that we're going through, okay? This is the homework assignment. It's also found on our Moodle site, right under the biome lecture overview page, which was what I was looking at right there. Here is the interactive link, okay? And I'm going to pull up the interactive so you'll see what it looks like. It's going to load up on your screen, and then you're going to see this beautiful kind of interactive map, all right? There's a homework assignment, which again, I'm going to show you in a sec. That is just kind of, you know, fill in the blank type thing after you've, you know, moved around the map a little bit to answer questions, and a Dropbox for that homework, okay? Now, like I said, you don't have to get it done that next day, but if you want to get feedback, if you feel like this is tough material for you before the quiz, then I would try to get it in on Monday or Wednesday, okay? But this is kind of straightforward memorization type stuff, all right? So let me bring you back to the biome overview lecture page, okay? We're going to briefly be talking about biomes in general, which can be defined by the type of soil, the type of moisture or precipitation, and temperature, right? And so those three things will determine what type of vegetation grows in these places. And then that means what kind of animals will be following, right? So this is the interactive, okay? When you click here or out in that outer shell, this is what's gonna pop out. You guys see that? Super cool, right? So we've got all the well, not all of them, but most of the biomes listed right here, okay? And you can type in any place. Like if Plattsburgh is where you live, you can type that in. I put it in here. You could type in, you know, back home or place you vacation to figure out what's going on. So it brings up the latitude and longitude. It tells you we are in the temperate deciduous forest biome, which is, I think you guys probably knew that already. It shows us how many reptile species, 7 reptile species, 21 amphibian species, and 53 mammal species are found, have been identified in this biome. So if you added all of those up, that's the species richness in this biome, okay? And that's going to be like one of the questions on the assignment, that you'll kind of have to have a sense of biodiversity, right? Based on species richness that it's telling you here. This is also a climate diagram. The lecture is going to show you that. But climate diagrams are just a quick visual of like what's going on temperature and precipitation wise in these places. Okay, so precipitation is the bar graph down the bottom. And these are the months on the x-axis. And the temperature are the dots that are above it. Okay, so you can see we have cold seasons and we have like warm seasons. You can click in various locations and it's going to tell you where you are. So now we're in the grassland biome, okay? And it's going to show you there's a bit of a difference in the climate diagram. Our species richness will vary, and so on and so forth. So you can learn more. You can do some comparisons between 2 biomes and stuff, okay? You guys get a good sense of this? Not too tricky, right? All right. Now, if you click on the homework that's right below the interactive, it's going to bring up this little handout. You guys can download it and you can answer the questions. Really, it's going to want to know what's your biome name, where's the location, latitude and longitude, what are the ranges of temps and precipitation, sum up your species richness, make some comparisons across those biomes, ponder stuff for a little bit, and so on and so forth. So it's pretty straightforward, basically having you compare a couple of them and explore the interactive module a bit. Sound good? Okay. All right. I just thought it was a really neat visual. Okay, so moving forward, these diagrams are kind of important just for you to think about where these places are located, right? This one in particular, I have it in the lecture as well. I want you to look kind of in a band running across, okay? When you think of the Earth, think of the biomes distributing themselves latitudinally, okay? You might have a band of really like wet biomes, and then following that at a lower latitude, you have a band of more dry latitude, and then wet, and then dry, and then wet. It kind of varies. So if you kind of scan across, you'll notice, oh, these dry ones, that are brown and yellow are deserty, okay? And then right below it, you might see more green, right? And so that becomes important as we talk about the limits to distribution lecture, but you'll learn a little bit more about it. This one's also important, hint, hint, hint. And I've got a couple slides in the lecture as well. It's looking at mean precipitation and the temperature, and it's kind of put the biomes in as blobs, okay? So if you look over here, tropical rainforest is up high on the temperature, and over here, it's also very wet, right? If we look over here at the Arctic, it's pretty cold, and it's also kind of dry, okay? And over here, the desert, it's really hot and really dry, right? So you can arrange them based on temperature and moisture in these kind of visual blobs. And you can imagine like a sponge, right? Your sponge is totally filled over here in the tropical rainforest. And now if you squeeze it, right, you can shift into deciduous forest. If you go colder, you can go down into conifer boreal forest. If you go warmer and a little drier, you go from the forest to a grassland habitat. And then if you go a little bit more dry and hot, you're going to go into the desert. Okay, so it's kind of like a sliding scale of temperature and moisture. Over here, you know, moving through deserts, that's one of my favorite places. And I've got a video here about what makes a desert, especially in the desert southwest of the US. There's 4 deserts out there. I don't know if you guys knew that. When we get to deserts, we'll cover that, and we'll cover it more with animals too and plants. But it gets super cold at night. If anybody's ever camped out there, right? Anybody camped out there? Really cold due to adiabatic cooling, okay? It has to do with how fast the molecules move as a function of pressure and whatnot. And it's super dry, right? But there can be periods of rain. And so I just threw in a video of like what can cause a desert. And it has to do with moisture moving in off the landscape, off of the ocean, rising when it hits a mountain, cooling and condensing, and raining on one side and being dry on the other side. And that's kind of a little video of it. Just a visual of some of the adaptations of these desert animals. So that's really, you know, a hot location. Grasslands, right? We have grasslands in the middle of our country where a lot of our vegetation, you know, wheat and cereal grains are grown. They call it the breadbasket, right? It's herbaceous. There's a lot of animals that live out there that group up out in the open. They've got to be fast to avoid their predators, right? Or they've got to be good at hiding. There's fires that happen out there. Remember the bison and fire, you know, there was a link there. We go to the savanna. Now we're kind of looking at African animals here, mostly open habitats, some trees and areas where there might be pockets of water, right? These animals tend to go in herds. They group up as a way of predator protection and so on, right? We get to more closed canopy forests now. We're sitting in the temperate forest. We have 4 seasons, right? Lots of diversity in these areas. You'll see when you compare your diversity in that homework assignment. But we actually have layers in our forests for the most part, unless we have a lot of deer where they eat all the understory, right? We've got layers of vegetation, which is good food, good resources, and, you know, places for organisms to live in cavities and nooks and crannies, right? And so that's kind of where we are in Plattsburgh. Tropical rainforests take it to the next level. Lots of rain, lots of nutrients tied up in the vegetation, right? Tons of layers. Not only do we have understory, mid canopy, and above canopy, we have vines all over the place, right? Just a ton of biomass tied up in the trees, right? So lots of available niche space, habitat resources for organisms to support the diversity, right? Now, boreal forest and taiga, that's kind of the Canada into, you know, Alaska, Canada zone, parts of Russia as well. We're talking about mostly conifer forests and very low in diversity, right? There's some places where there's going to be permafrost. This is a place, surprisingly, where there's a lot of fires, because you probably associate boreal forest with colder, right? There's a lot of lightning strikes out there. And so in the summertime, it's crazy fires. A lot of the people on fire crews fly out there to fight these fires in this area. There's also a lot of wetlands, and that's a result of, you know, the glaciers melting in these zones and creating these kind of pools of water. But, you know, places where you'd see moose, bear, wolves, you know, where I did my research, that's boreal forest. We see parts of that when we go and hike in the Adirondacks, right? Tundra, a little bit farther north, we're talking kind of Arctic Circle type stuff, where vegetation is going to not be tall, but low to the ground, right? Dealing with ice, dealing with cold, dealing with that like darkness all the time, and then a brief growing season, right? And tons of permafrost. So these organisms, plants and animals have to be really well adapted to that. So those are the terrestrial biomes we're going to be covering in the lecture. We'll also be transitioning to the aquatic biomes, and mostly that's like freshwater, lakes, ponds, streams, and marine systems, or the oceans, right? We'll also cover some of the interesting things like mangroves, hydrothermal vents, things like that. So again, just some, you know, summary information. Freshwater has moving water or still water. Moving water is lodic. I always remember it because it has an O in it, lodic, moving. Again, all this I'm going to go into in the lecture, but just an overview here. And lentic is the still stagnant water you might find in a pond, right? Wetland systems, there's so much variety in wetland systems. So you guys have seen the marshes probably out where we live, but swamps are just wetlands that have trees. Bogs are the ones that are kind of squishy when you walk on it, and they have pitcher plants and really cool. It's a low nutrient habitat, so they have to find ways to get nutrition, and they do that oftentimes, you know, by eating other insects. If you've seen pitcher plants and sundews, they're really cool adaptations. Even if you walk in like Ruger Woods and you saw like maybe a tree fell over and pulled up a whole bunch of soil, now you have like a hill, a little tiny hill, that'll fill up with snow, and then in the springtime it melts and it becomes this little tiny fleeting wetland. They call them ephemeral ponds, right? And so frogs, that's really important for frogs and other amphibians to lay their eggs and move to highlands for other parts of their lifestyle. When we get to the marine or the, you know, the ocean systems, these are going to be organisms that have to adapt to the salt water, right? And also to depth, to pressure, because some of the ocean is quite deep, right? So they've got those kinds of adaptations. You know, access to nutrients might be up at the top where the plants can live, right? Plants are going to be constricted to where the light can, you know, the light zone, the photic zone. But way down at the bottom of the ocean, they have to use other energy sources like sulfur. And so we'll learn about some of these really cool organisms that have adapted to that, okay? So I didn't want you guys to forget that on our overview lecture page, there's supplemental stuff that will reinforce the lecture, okay? So make sure that when we get to, you know, each of those units that you guys get on there and check them out, okay? Any questions? All right, so that's a good overview. And now let's begin. So geographical ecology, this is also known as biomes. And again, a lot of this might be review from some of your, you know, earlier stuff, just making sure you have a sense of where our plants and animals are located and what their conditions are that keeps them in those locales. Climate, very important. This is broad scale patterns of moisture and temperature. It's not the same as weather. That's the fine scale kind of local regional stuff. And they, you know, climate, temperature, and moisture, as I've mentioned earlier, will be super important in dictating where we're going to find these plants and animals and what that dominant form would be, okay? And so how can climate influence the distribution of our organisms? This is just like one example, okay? Every organism has a physiological tolerance, right? We do too, right? How many of you guys have lived in Florida? Anybody? Or been down to Florida? It's crazy hot, humid, right? I would last 2 seconds there, right? My body is not conditioned for it. I don't think anyone in my family has the genes to handle it, right? Certain organisms can go down to these areas, right? They can expand their range into these areas that are not ideal, but they won't necessarily do extremely well. They may not have twins, right? They may not live as long, right? It's a stressful type of scenario. So every organism has a range. However, the majority of them and where they do the best, where they reproduce and can support their offspring, will occur in a core zone that meets their physiological needs, right? Now, with climate changing all the time, imagine these ranges are going to have to shift. And what we've been learning is that they tend to be shifting northward. I think you've heard of that. Northward in latitude and northward in elevation, right? And that puts them in contact with, land use issues, right? They've moved northward and now there's a city right there. Or maybe they're moving northward in latitude, in elevation, and they've got less and less habitat available to them. Okay, so here's an example. We might lose organisms on the edge of their range. And hopefully, are you guys seeing? Has it switched over to something? Okay.
Yeah.
I thought this was just really, a cool thing, kind of showing migration paths these organisms are having. Imagine they're moving in these zones, right? But they're encountering, different communities. Maybe they're not going to be welcomed into these communities. Maybe there's no vacant niche for them, not a lot of resources. And so they won't survive as well as they're having to make these movements northward, right? So just kind of a cool visual to show you guys that. So we expect, as these organisms are adjusting to climate, we're going to probably lose some of the organisms on the fringe, but retain the organisms in the core. That's kind of the expectation. Here's an example with the meadowlark. I'm sorry, with the bobolink. No, this is the meadowlark. Bobolinks are very similar. They're grassland nesting birds. They like to be out in the open. They eat the seeds on the tops of the tall grasses and whatnot. And so this is their range. You can see they kind of all over the East Coast, mid-Atlantic states. They're all over kind of the eastern part of the country. You'll notice the darker spots are where they do really, really well. Okay, you'll see population numbers above 100 where it's super dark, but they are in these outskirts, but perhaps not in the greatest abundance. And that has, again, a lot to do with their physiological range. The idea being we expect these ranges to tighten and for them to shift in that northward direction. So that's how climate is going to be impacting the distribution and abundance of these organisms, and also where biomes are found. We'll learn that shortly when we get to the dry tropical forests. What kind of implications does climate have for fisheries? And I guess coincidentally us, right? If anybody eats fish. So this is a visual of the bottom temperature increasing over time, okay, in the oceans. And there's a trend that it's been increasing due to climate change, right? Number of fish species collected over time has been increasing. Notice the slope has increased. And the temperature is increasing as well. Now, this might seem like a really good thing, right? More fish, more people can eat the fish, right? That doesn't seem like a bad thing. Maybe climate is helping the fisheries, and ultimately us if we are piscivores, right? So this 2-degree temperature increase has increased species richness of fish, seemingly good. However, when you go and you look down at it, it's increasing the numbers of species of the kind of non-good delicacy fish, right? These are fish that nobody really wants to eat. Maybe they're super bony. Maybe they don't have a lot of meat. Maybe they're smaller in size, but it's not really making a helpful change for the fisheries, right? And maybe not for the marine system in general, okay? So biomes broadly, and I'm reiterating it so you guys don't forget, hint, hint, very important stuff, right? They are broad classifications of biotic units. We've talked about deserts, temperate forest, boreal forest, right? The first folks kind of associated with it were Clements and Shelford back in the 30s. And Clements we'll hear again when we talk about communities, forest communities, biotic communities, okay? Biomes are classified not by the animals, which is kind of my thing, right? But by the plants. So it's the dominant vegetation in these locations, and that is cued in based on temperature, moisture, and soil, right? Keep those three things in mind, right? These were just some examples, and you saw them in our interactive of the biomes. And again, these general biotic communities, don't forget, hint, hint, notice the stars. I can't reinforce that enough, right? That dominant vegetation type is going to be, you know, a function of your temperature, your moisture or precipitation. And thirdly, maybe not as important necessarily as those first two, the soil type. So I'm going to give you a little bit of soil type information as we go through these biomes. And so trees, shrubs, grasses, you know, these are the dominant kind of vegetation that we're talking about. When we say the word forests, think of your canopy being closed. When we say the word grassland, think of it being an open canopy. Now kind of consider what kind of vegetation would be there and what kind of animals would be there, and the adaptations that they might need, right? Woodland and savanna, these are places where, you know, the Serengeti, there's going to be a mix of grasses and trees, but the trees are going to be probably more sparse, right, as we mentioned. Places that have mostly shrubs and grasses will be more open, okay? And deserts are going to be even, remember, squeezing that sponge, right? Deserts are going to have even less available vegetation at all, right? In some places. And this is a function of nutrients, right? Nutrients will vary as a function of the biome, right? And net primary production, so how much biomass can grow in these areas, does vary according to biome, okay? And you'll see that, right? Notice up here with the terrestrial ecosystems, totally makes sense that tropical rainforests are going to have a lot of NPP, or net primary production, right? A lot of biomass, a lot of energy available for the trophic levels above, right? There'll probably be a lot of predators in these tropical rainforests because there's a lot of, you know, food for them. And then we can kind of walk our way down, right? We go through temperate rainforest, temperate seasonal forest, that's where we live, right? Boreal forest, we're talking Canada, a little bit less. Savanna, now we're getting into kind of the grassy habitats, less than the forests, right? And then we get into the more extremes, the tundra, the desert, even less, you know, available primary production. Aquatic systems, right? Swamps and marshes, coral reefs, no surprise there, a lot of NPP. Open ocean, there's really a limitation of nutrients. You'll learn about this a little bit later in these open oceans. People have actually suggested dumping iron into the oceans to create algae blooms. So there's more less limitation of a critical nutrient for these organisms. Bacteria need it to be able to photosynthesize. Okay, again, temperature, precipitation, really, really important in these biomes, right? Climate's going to vary according to latitude. Remember, I talked about the bands, right? One band's going to be wet, the next one will be dry, and so on. Boundaries tend to, you know, they're a little bit indistinct, so you may not see an abrupt shift between desert and a tropical zone, right? It might kind of grade into each other. And certainly fire and disturbance and whatnot makes it tricky, you know, to see where those boundaries are located. Again, just a visual, nothing you have to commit to memory, but look at the banding patterns, right? Try and see that it kind of tries to run in a horizontal direction according to latitude. And these are very descriptive. You know, we have more broad kind of classifications of our biomes, but, you know, I'm not breaking out the tropics by different forest types. We're just going to say tropical rainforest, okay? Remember, this was one of our important slides, right? We've got that sliding scale of precipitation and temperature. See where these guys, you know, filter out, be able to kind of recreate this, right? Or know where they belong, right? That's a really important slide. We're going to have your tropics being wet and hot. We're going to have our Arctic being cold and dry. And then there's going to be gradations in between, right? And you'll see there's some overlap. Remember, we talked about the boundaries being a little bit difficult to distinguish sometimes. This is the same slide, just flipped the axes, okay? So here we've got precipitation on the Y, temperature on the X, where we had it the other way. I just want to make sure you know how to see it both ways, okay? So spend some time with that, kind of make sure you understand why that would be, why they fall out where they do, okay? And again, just imagining that sliding scale, right? This is really what this take-home message is this visual right here, right? You go from hot to cold, and you go from rainforest to tundra, right? You go from wet to dry, and you go from rainforest to savanna to desert, right? It's that sliding scale, it's that sponge scenario. And that's kind of really the big take home on those slides, okay? All right, whoops. Vegetation and seasonality, okay? In areas where you have constant rain, you're going to have lush forests, tropical rainforest, temperate rainforest. The Pacific Northwest is a temperate rainforest, okay? Tropical rainforests, you know, in Brazil, okay? Constant rain, very lush. Animals can adapt because they know that it's always going to be that way. It's typically going to be that way, right? Seasonality, you know, causes organisms to have different kinds of adaptations. They're going to maybe have small leaves that can fall off. They're going to have leaves that have adaptations to not dry out, right? So places like the chaparral, which happens to be kind of like California mountain zone close to the coast. There's a tiny little chaparral location. These are kind of like shrub habitats, but Mediterranean forests are that way as well. Again, we're going to get deeper into that, just kind of showing you seasonality will look different based on how that, you know, what organisms can tolerate seasonality versus constant conditions. When you have lots of water, you're going to have woody plants, okay? And the idea being the roots don't have to be very deep, very extensive. There's a lot of water available to them. So they can put that energy into biomass above ground, okay? And so you'll find a lot of places where there's water, you'll have woody trees, right? Or more shrubs and less grasses. A lot of above ground biomass compared to below. You're going to have organisms that will photosynthesize, so they'll put energy into leaves. You're going to have structural support for the above ground biomass, so they're going to put energy into like making the woody structure, the lignin and whatnot, right? And they're going to need to have ways to get their energy up and down, the water up and down, the sugars up and down, xylem and phloem, right? Because they have a lot of above ground biomass. And this is, again, in places where there's more moisture, right? That's what your plants are going to look like. They're going to be more above ground, less below ground. And they can compete for light, you know, as they're above ground. They'll shift their leaf structure. You guys have probably seen a tree out in the middle of a cornfield that's really wide open canopy. They're beautiful, right? But if you walk in a forest, you might look up at the tree and they're all kind of scrawny, kind of stuck like this next to each other. They're competing for light in the canopy, right? And the other one didn't need to. There's high risk of fire in habitats like this, right? Because there's a lot of above ground biomass that's fuel. Now, switching over to places where we have less moisture, plants are going to need to have deep roots or very extensive fine root hairs at the surface, right? So you'll maybe have less above ground biomass, maybe more below ground biomass. Imagine pulling up, you know, a flower in a meadow, or pulling up, you know, grass, a bunch grass in a meadow, and you look at it and whoa, I didn't expect that I would see, you know, that much of a root ball, but that's what you find, right? So really cool. You can kind of see how the root depth varies here so that they don't compete as much with one another. These are going to be organisms that are going to be in drier conditions. So actually they're going to photosynthesize a little differently. And we're going to learn about this when we cover the plant adaptation lecture. When things get into warmer habitats, they will often adapt to C4 photosynthesis instead of C3 photosynthesis. You might have heard of that. We'll cover it, you know, more in depth in plants, as I mentioned. Again, it's going to be drier. They have to not dry out. That's what desiccation means, right? So they'll be adapted to not dry out as much. Fire is also going to be common in this kind of a habitat as well, because it's drier conditions. If lightning strikes, they're in trouble, right? And plants will be a little bit smaller and, you know, less structure because they're not putting, you know, energy into being strong and tough above ground. so they can bounce back a little bit more quickly. If you've ever gone to a place where a fire has occurred, you'll probably notice that grasses come back like within a couple days, right? So they resprout. Now, you guys saw on the interactive, the visual of a biome displaying temperature and moisture. It's called a climatogram, okay? And when you click your dot to all these different locales, you'll notice that the temperature, which is gonna be the dots, right, in the line graph here, will shift. It'll, maybe there'll be a bump up here and, it'll be low down there. And the precipitation will always show up as bars below. I'm not going to have you guys memorize these, but you should know what they are. You should kind of be aware that they are going to shift depending on what biome you're checking out. Okay, we're going to move into the tropical rainforest. Does anyone have any questions so far? All right. What's the water going to be like in these areas? Moisture, high, low, tropical, high, right. Fairly constant, right? So the organisms kind of can adapt knowing that this is how it's going to be most of the time. And temperature is going to be hot as well, right? So it's up there in that upper right in that first diagram that we looked at. Now, we find the tropical rainforest kind of around the equator, right? And it's going to be warm, minimum temperatures about over 18 degrees C, and precipitation, nothing you need to memorize. Don't memorize this stuff, okay? Take home messages: hot, humid, right? Moist. All right, now soils. Soils in the tropical rainforest, I do want you to commit this to memory, and I'm going to give you a little way that I remember stuff. Don't laugh at me. Sometimes these things help, right? Now, whoops. In a tropical rainforest, there's a ton of above ground lush biomass, right? You got all these layers of things and vines everywhere and monkeys going all over the place, right? All the nutrients are in the above ground growth. They're not in the soil, right? So the soil, which is surprising, kind of, right? You would think, oh man, it's lush there. They're gonna have really rich soils. The nutrients are in the above ground biomass, not in the soil. So if you burn everything, right, isn't the Amazon on fire right now, right? Tons of fires. The nutrients are returning to the soil, right? But if you deforest, right, which is another concern in these tropical rainforests, is deforestation for growing crops, there's going to be limited nutrients left in that soil for any plant to grow, okay? So the soil is poor, and the term SOLS, sols, means soil, okay? So oxysol, I think of poor, has the two O's, oxysol has the O. That's how I remember that the soils are often oxysols in the tropical rainforest, because they're poor, they're tied up in that above ground vegetation, okay? Tons of biodiversity. This is the place you want to go if you want the highest species richness, right? And these are just some examples of locales, places, and some of the organisms that you'll see. Beautiful visual here, right, of all the layers, the lianas, those vines and whatnot. So you can see the vines, you've got really neat organisms, you've got such weight of biomass that the trees have to adapt with extra supports. Have you seen trees that have stumps that come off of the branches to keep them supported, right? And the same is true of the roots here, right? They buttress themselves, they kind of support themselves a little bit more. But look at all the layering. Again, that's just kind of reinforcing how lush it is and how much, this would be a hotspot of biodiversity, right? Again, looking at where they're distributed right around the equator, thinking of that latitudinal band of tropical rainforests. And again, looking at the climatogram here, with warm temps and really high moisture. And we see that in all these locales, okay? All right, as I mentioned, soils can vary And the big one I want you guys to focus on is oxasols. Really, that's the only one I really want you to focus on for this particular biome, okay? Poor quality, deeply weathered, but there's also a couple of other ones. The andesol, I always remember andesol, like volcano, it has the an in it as well. So these are deeply weathered soils as well, okay? Fun facts about our tropical rainforest. I try to pepper a bunch of this stuff in as we go. This is a place where you would go and harvest for medicinal purposes. So there's a yew tree out there. The Taxol drug, if you go and you were to work at the bark of a particular tree, and you can click on this and check it out, that has been a really effective treatment in breast cancer, right? Taxol is a drug that's used to, I think, elicit apoptosis or cell death in certain species. I'm not sure why it's not allowing us to see it. So the PDF that I've got of the lecture, you guys, if you're going through it as well, you can hyperlink, it'll bring this stuff up so you can read a little bit more about it. So this is just a story about this particular drug, Taxol, and, you know, finding the drug on the Pacific yew tree, okay? So check that stuff out if you want, if you're into learning that. In addition, climate is affecting the Amazon rainforest in extreme ways. There's massive droughts. Both of these talk about the droughts, okay? But I want you to think about this, and as I click on it and kind of bring it up here. Tons of above ground biomass. What does that do to carbon? What are all of those living things doing to carbon?
Absorbing.
Yeah, pulling it in, right? So they're sequestering this carbon, so they're considered carbon sinks. They're drawing it in like a sink will with the water, right? If a drought happens, what happens to the plants?
Like a long-term drought, like
Yeah,
they'll die.
yeah, plants will die. What happens when an organism dies to the carbon?
Was released. I mean,
Yeah.
if it breaks down.
Exactly. So then, you know, bacteria, fungus, all this stuff's going to work at it. So imagine the Amazonian forest. We've got fires knocking back all this power to sequester the carbon. We've got people deforesting. Now we have a drought affecting all the other places. And so these massive trees are dying, all these plants are dying, and carbon is being released as they begin to kind of rot, right? And so you go from carbon sink to carbon source. This is a huge concern. And, you know, it wouldn't be a big deal if it was like every, 12 years or so you have these droughts, but we're talking like sustained droughts, right? So this is a huge worry that we have for this particular biome, okay? Now, nutrient cycling is going to be rapid, right? We are in these conditions. Imagine like you stick, a loaf of bread in a warm, wet place. It's going to decompose, right, really quickly. Fungus, bacteria are going to work on it really quickly. So rapid rates of nutrient cycling. Nutrients go immediately from the soil when that organism kind of releases and dies and goes right back into new biomass. And that's why if we go in and deforest the Amazon rainforest, we're in deep trouble in terms of nutrients, right? Anything that wants to grow there is going to probably need a lot of fertilizer, right? If we remove the biomass. Okay, tropics and some semi-arid regions. Anybody ever go to Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, beautiful, right? Anybody go to El Yunque, the rainforest?
Yeah, I went to the rainforest.
Yeah. So there is also like another locale in Puerto Rico that has a tropical dry forest, okay? And so these are places, these semi-arid regions, where there's a lot of seasonality. You get a dry and you get a rainy season. The closer you are to the equator, it's going to be more wet. The farther away, it's going to be a little more dry. We tend to have tropical broadleaf forests when it gets more dry, replaced with these tropical dry forests that are going to be adapted to being dry. They're going to have things like swollen root balls, to hold the water, these trees. They're going to have bark that's green so it can photosynthesize when it has to give off when the leaves drop because it's so dry, right? They don't want to lose the water, so they drop the leaves, but they can photosynthesize in their bark. They'll have tiny leaves, they'll have waxy leaves, right? All these adaptations to being dry. Animals, it's hotter there, so they're going to have to adapt to warm, less water, and so they go into kind of a hibernation, a short-term hibernation in heat that's called estivation. I'll talk more about this stuff when we get to animals too, okay? And so there is an interesting, this article right here, my sister lives in Houston. Anybody know Houston area? It's boiling hot anyways, right? Look down here, this hyperlink right here goes to an article that shows you we have an expectation in the short term that these dry tropical forests are going to move into the US. They weren't really there yet. And now we predict in time, we're going to have them in Florida, where like the mangroves and stuff were, right? The Gulf Coast and on into Texas, right? So just crazy changes that are occurring due to climate. Okay, we're gonna, and there's just some pictures of them, lots of fires because it's dry, right? Makes sense that would be the case. Let's pause there. We'll pick up on Monday. I hope you guys have an awesome weekend. Any questions? Don't forget, feel free to check out that HHMI interactive, do the homework if you want. No major rush on it. It's just kind of review of the biomes, but enjoy the Super Bowl. Use Zoom if you're gonna, hang with friends, have fun. I'm going to be making all those high calorie meals, all those snacks. All right, you guys, have a good weekend. I'll see you Monday.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Have a good
All righty.
weekend.
Bye, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
I have a quick question.
Yeah. What's up, Shay?
Is there like a specific day that the homework is due? I was just wondering.
No.
Okay.
If you feel good about it, and you're busy and stuff and you can't get to it, say to drop it in the Dropbox Monday or Wednesday, as long as you're feeling okay for the quiz, there's no major rush on it.
Okay.
Really, when it comes down to it, the homework, like I said, I accept it throughout the semester. When it comes down to the math stuff, sometimes people struggle with the math. And so if a quiz is coming or a test is coming and you're not comfortable with the math, having my feedback is probably super helpful that we could work together on it. But for biomes, it's a lot of memorization. This first unit, this first test and quiz and stuff is a lot of memorization, less of the skill type stuff. So, if you can get it in Monday or Wednesday, great. If not, that's fine as well. It's more so just, to keep you on task.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Yep. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Bye.
I also have a question.
Sure. Who is this? Mia?
Yeah, hi.
Hey.
On the homework, part 2 or like question 2 asks us to complete the table with other students. Did you want us to complete it with other students, or do you want us to just go through and fill out the
Unless you're buddy with somebody and you want to team up remotely, but I would say working solo is probably a safe bet.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks. And I'll remind everybody that too.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bridget?